Hello and welcome back to Radio 2. So today we're going to continue where we left off on the previous lesson. And in the previous lesson, we looked at clocks and formations. So today we'll be continuing with the formation side of it. So where we ended off the previous lesson was we spoke about the Mexican on the bicycle, where we said, where we refer to one thought per link. Okay, so one thought process per link. Because what did we say? We said people are distracted in their everyday lives. They tend to do more than one thing at a time. So if you're listening to radio, they tend to not only listen to radio, but to be driving while listening to radio, or to be cooking while listening to radio, or to be showering while listening to radio, or to be doing work while listening to radio. Okay, so there's all these things that are happening at the same time as listening to radio. And we also said that this isn't a problem when you're simply listening to music, because music gets taken into your brain through a different path. Okay, there's a different channel specifically for when you listen to music versus what you're doing. So Johnson tells us that listening to music is processed by the brain, such as listening to spoken words. So me speaking, listening to spoken words is also processed by the channel that processes foreground thoughts. Okay, so the reading and writing, or foreground tasks. That's why finding yourself in an unfamiliar area, driving the car while someone is speaking next to you, is such a difficult task. The reason for this is that these two activities are competing for a single channel. So what does this mean for us as radio presenters? This means we have to engage listeners by using simple and easy to understand conversational language. So today what we're going to be looking at is techniques that can help grab a listener's attention away from the things that they're currently doing. So the one thought rule says that you should always keep your links as simple as possible by only utilizing one thought. We used the example of if you wanted to talk about the Academy Awards and who was on the red carpet at the awards, that the link and content should only be structured then around that. The presenter, you as a presenter, shouldn't now switch from chatting about this red carpet event to chatting about the Golden Globes, for instance, and about the looks on that red carpet, followed by a story about, I don't know, your matric film awards or your matric dance, followed by a story about your favorite high school teacher. Okay, why? Because this makes the link hard. Why? Because this makes the link hard to understand and hard to follow. Keep in mind that listeners are distracted and probably doing something else at the same time as listening to the radio. So they're only technically listening with one ear, okay? You can't demand attention if your links are difficult to follow. So keeping it simple will help you attract firstly, and secondly, retain that listener's attention. And with that in mind, we're starting today's lesson, which starts on page 120 in Next Level Radio. So what we'll be looking at is called the 5 rules of storytelling. Storytelling, I've told you before, is the most important thing that a presenter can have in his or her repertoire. Okay, it's important that you know how to tell stories. So once a presenter has decided what they once thought of the Mexican on the bicycle will be about, you have to start preparing and curate your content. And the best way of doing this is by using these 5 rules of storytelling. Every great story can usually be broken up into 5 different parts. They're loosely based on Tracy Johnson's The Science of Stories, 5 storytelling steps, which is in Johnson 2012, and comprises of the following. So firstly the hook. Secondly, the crumbs. Thirdly, dress up. The 4th one, the payoff, and lastly, the blackout. So we'll start with the hook. The presenter starts by preparing the hook. This is the most important part of this link. It consists of the opening moment that will grab a listener's attention and get them hooked on the content. David Lloyd explains how the start of the story is the most important part by noting that if listeners miss the start, they might just give up on the remainder. So in an article commissioned by Microsoft Canada, 2,000 Canadians were given a variety of tests to help discover the length of engagement and attention span. In the study, a graphic is presented from research that shows that since the year 2000 up until the year 2013, attention spans have dropped from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. This range is smaller than the attention span of a goldfish, which is 9 seconds. So our attention spans are smaller than that of a goldfish. This means that a presenter probably has around 8 seconds to grab a listener's attention when getting into a link. If you were doing radio back in the year 2000, you would have had more time to grab a person's attention than you do now. But because of people's shrinking attention spans, the new 8-second period has become a challenge. As the presenters must come up with clever, engaging hook that is tighter, quicker, and more immediate than ever, okay? So just from the research that I just told you about, this Microsoft Canada research, we can see that listeners make a decision to stay with this link within about the first 8 seconds. This doesn't necessarily imply that the listeners will tune out of the link by switching radio stations or mediums. However, if the listener is not almost immediately engaged, the listener could mentally have tuned out and start thinking about something else other than the link. Mental tune out, just so we can make this clear, mental tune out is just as problematic as a physical tune out would be, because the listener is still not listening to your link. To stress the importance of a hook, some research tells us that 8 seconds is actually still too long. Spotify did research, and their research has shown that roughly 24% of songs are skipped within 5 seconds, 29% after 10 seconds, 35% after 30 seconds, and 49% before the end of the song. So there's more research that was conducted. The YouTube Insights team in 2015 released an article titled "The First 5 Seconds Creating YouTube Ads That Break Through in a Skippable World." Their data suggests that at least 50% of the audience takes between 3 to 5 seconds to decide if they will keep on watching a video or if they will continue to a next video. If we use this research and we want to apply this to a radio link, we have to hook the listeners in under 5 seconds. Do you know how quick that is? Think about the first 5 to 10 seconds of the link. Think about the first 5 to 10 seconds of the link as the first spoon of a delicious meal. Okay? If the first spoon is delicious, you will usually try another and continue eating. What we're going to look at now are some tricks and applications to help construct the hook. Firstly, ask your listener something. A question directed to a listener brings them into the conversation immediately. Done correctly, a question can spark a sense of curiosity, and a listener can become involved in the conversation almost immediately. So if we take our red carpet scenario of earlier, here are some examples. When did you last watch something that wasn't that funny, but it reminded you of something really funny, and you burst out laughing so loudly that everyone whom you were watching thought you were mad? Or another example, when is it not appropriate to laugh at someone who fell? These are examples of physically asking your listener something. A hook and a question do not, however, have to be that literal. A hook could be a statement that could be interpreted as a question, a rhetorical question, or a statement that simply creates intrigue. Any way you use it, asking a listener a question in the first 5 to 10 seconds of a link gets the listener curious, intrigued, and engaged. The second one, these are all on page 122, by the way. The second one is set up the conflict immediately. Every great story requires conflict. Conflict is the secret spice that makes a great link, or that makes a link great. By immediately pointing to the conflict in the link, the listener is transported into the middle of a situation in which they are intrigued to see the outcome. It makes the listener wonder about what will happen next. So here's a statement that shows how we can grab someone's attention. So let's say my co-host's name is John. So John is arguing with me about this next piece and says I may not post this video. Or I have a problem. Do I post this video and risk losing my co-host but make your day? Okay, so just think about the way that was phrased. The third one there, make strong declarations, statements, proclamations, pronouncements, affirmations, or assertions. As I've mentioned before, great radio is emotive. A technique that helps to create emotive radio is to make bold or strong statements that will create an emotional trigger for the audience. Whether they disagree or agree with the statement doesn't really matter, as long as they feel strongly about it. So an example would be, if it was not for the fall on the red carpet last night, the Oscars would have been a bore. Or if it was not for whoever the actor's name is, tumbling down the red carpet, the Oscars would have been a waste of time. Okay, so you will notice that these two statements that I just gave you were opinion-based. So why? Because they gave the listener something to react to and are always more powerful than fact-based statements. By triggering an emotional reaction, you immediately involve the listeners in the link. Humans are naturally inquisitive people. We all are. So once you trigger mystery and intrigue in the hook, you will be able to keep the listeners listening to that link because they'll be interested. So a presenter must give a small part of the story away, but never too much. Set up an expectation that a strong payoff is about to present itself and that it will be worth your listeners' while. So for example, let's say whoever the actor was that we just used that fell in our previous scenario. What do XYZ and John have in common? Or the second one there, can you guess why a small tumble on the red carpet has created a war in the studio this morning? Okay, so that kind of stuff, because obviously John also took a tumble at some point, and this is what we're going to be talking about a bit later on. Even if the listener has no invested interest in the story, or no natural interest in the characters or the topic that's being discussed, listeners will usually still stay to hear the resolution because of their inquisitive nature. There's an example in page 123, which I'm not going to read to you now, but which I want you to read. Example 4a, the heading there says Tuks FM Promise by Grant Nash in memory of Janus Aislinn, 1980 to 2016. And this is a real life account written by Grant Nash, one of South Africa's famous radio presenters. Developing a hook takes time and effort. The important thing to remember is that every link has to have a really strong start. Without it, you will lose the listener before your link has even really begun. So in essence, thereafter, every piece of work that follows from this link would be wasted, because without a strong hook, listeners tune out. First, physically, by switching off your show, or mentally, by starting to think about something else. The hook should be curated and form a part of every presenter's daily show prep. Once a hook has been planned and curated, you can move on to curating the body of the link, okay? And that's where we come to the crumbs. So the body of the link is referred to as the crumbs. Similar to the fairy tale in which Hansel and Gretel dropped breadcrumbs so that they could find their way home. A presenter must keep dropping mini payoffs, so little twists and turns in the link or the story to keep the listener engaged and intrigued until the very end. Essentially, the aim of the crumbs is to set the story up and to establish something that pays off later. Every link has to have forward momentum that leads as a path or crumbs towards the payoff. No matter how good the hook or even the punchline or the payoff at the end of the link, if the setup or the body of the link does not move every 7 to 14 seconds. So these crumbs then, the mini payoffs, and they will change in direction. So that changes in direction and twists and turns in the story that move the story forward and that keep the listener interested through a strategy of planting ideas that will be resolved in the playoff later on. So there are three main reasons why listeners lose interest in links or stories in the middle, in this middle phase of a link. Firstly, if you're trying too hard to make a listener laugh. As a rule of thumb, look for one punchline or payoff for every link. If a presenter can get two good laughs in every link, that's even better. The chances, however, of a third big laugh moment happening are very slim, and looking for it in a link usually feels forced, may annoy the listeners and may make the listeners tune out, okay? So don't go overboard with trying to make your listener laugh. The second one, trying too hard and then too many phone calls or voice notes. Listener interaction on the phone or through voice notes is a really important part of most shows and adds character to the show. However, you should generally aim to take great stories that have different angles, have strong hooks, payoffs, and add to the entertainment value of the link. Then take 3 pieces, but very rarely take more than that. Okay. Moreover, always structure your listener interaction in every link, using your second strongest piece first, whereupon you move to your weakest of the 3, and then you end with your strongest piece, okay? So again, always structure your listener interaction in every link using your second strongest piece first, whereafter you move on to your weakest of the 3 and then end with your strongest interaction. The rule of thumb is when a listener says goodbye, the link is over, okay? Sticking to this usually forces a presenter to end on a high and to leave the link at its peak. So keeping the following placement theory at hand helps to structure all interactive pieces on a show. And this placement theory, then we said the first piece must be the second strongest, the second piece must be the weakest of the 3, the third piece must be the strongest piece, and you black out as soon as the piece is over. Talk radio is slightly different. Here, presenters and producers should only be concerned with the value of every interaction. The call screener or producer should always ask, will this caller add to the rhetoric? Will they introduce a point that moves the story forward without derailing the conversation? Will they add to the overall entertainment of the link? If the answer is yes to all 3 of these questions, then the callers should be allowed on air. And then the third reason people lose The third reason people lose interest is because of too many stories or topics. Every link should focus on one main story, theme, or topic. Everything around the story should contribute to the story, advance the story, and move it forward. In a show with multiple characters and cast members, pick one main storyteller. The main story should be told in the link, and the other characters on the show should only contribute to the story. Take note that there will be cases, especially in talk radio or very busy commercial music shows, where the show needs to move from one topic to the next in one link. This is called a multi-break link. The transition should either be signaled deliberately to the listener, so they are aware of the switch or the change in topics. So this can be done through imaging, a change in a music bed, or a deliberate announcement of the change. Or it needs to be done so seamlessly that the listener does not consciously realize they've moved with the story and the show to a different topic. So it should be the goal of a presenter to avoid these three pitfalls we just mentioned. So you as a presenter should really try to avoid these three main reasons and try to keep your listeners listening for as long as possible. So don't try too hard to make listeners laugh. Don't add too many phone calls or voice notes to a story, and don't add too many stories or topics to a link. In essence, you want to make them stay to hear your next link. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at other techniques and skill that can help extend a link engagement. Based on the earlier attention-grabbing research that we mentioned, or based on the earlier research that we mentioned with regards to people's attention spans being shorter than that of a goldfish, one can say that a presenter should be looking at dropping crumbs every 7 to 14 seconds, okay, as mentioned. These little twists and turns in the story will keep the story flowing with a momentum that moves it forward and keeps the listeners interested. So think about movie trailers, okay? Movie trailers are usually very good examples of this. So good movie trailers will change scenes, moods, momentum, and storylines every 10 seconds or so. Any longer and the movie trailer seems to drag and start getting dull. Whereas anything shorter, and it feels like a continuous high-speed car chase. Good movie trailers usually take the viewer through 3 phases in the trailer. So the first phase would be the viewer has no idea what is going on. The second phase, the drama is compounded and exaggerated, leaving the viewer confused, immersed, and hooked in the storyline or on the storyline. The viewer is then excited to get to the conclusion. And the third phase then, this is where there's a sense of conclusion, but only enough for the viewer to go out and watch the film. If a radio presenter can get a listener feeling this way, that listener will stay. That listener will stay focused throughout the entire link. In a performance link, the listener will reach a conclusion, but will have enjoyed the link enough to stay listening to the next radio piece. The way I'm saying it now makes it sound like it's an easy thing to do, but it's not. It takes many hours of patient practice. But once a presenter masters the ability to keep a listener engaged, you are well on your way to becoming radio royalty, okay? So as much as it's something that'll take a long time for you to practice, and it takes a lot of practice, if you can do that and you can do it well, you are set. So 4 tips that can help a presenter master the dropping of clever crumbs. Get the listener's buy-in. Keep it short, sharp, and simple. Paint a picture and use emotive language. Speak only in the active voice, never the passive. So if we look at getting the listener's buy-in, if a presenter can get a listener to agree with them within the first few seconds of the body of the link, then the presenter is on their way to keeping the listener engaged. This means that you as a presenter need to know your listeners. You need to know who is tuning in and who is actively listening to you. By knowing who they are, knowing their interests, and having a meaningful data set of facts about them. Television networks, so TV networks, are especially good at getting their viewers to agree with them. They do this by reflecting their listeners' worldviews, and they support these views more often than not. Look at a conservative television channel, like, for instance, Fox News in the United States. Their content is targeted at conservatives, and they know the exact political views that resonate with their viewers. Radio presenters should be the same and look for agreement from their listeners earlier in their links. Keep it short, sharp, and simple. A presenter must always remember that listeners are engaged in other actions when listening to radio. They're almost always listening with what I said earlier, one ear or half an ear, if you want to call it like that, which means it's essential to keep the narrative simple, short, and easy to follow, which will always help keep the listener engaged. Third there, paint a picture and use emotive language. You as a presenter should always try to engage the listener's imagination. Why? Because radio is theater of the mind. Using emotive language helps build the story and create a picture in the listener's mind. Phrasing like, imagine this, take a moment to picture this, can you imagine if, remember when, or think about it, are just a few of these examples of phrases that can help engage a listener's imagination. And then the last one, they speak only in the active voice, never the passive. This one is easier said than done. It's not an easy skill to master, and it takes a lot of discipline. Likeable presenters use the active voice more often because it's engaging and personable. Active voice sentences always flow more smoothly and easier for a listener to follow than passive voice sentences. Passive voice sentences make a listener work harder to understand the sentences than the active alternative. There are some examples. On page 127, there are examples of active versus passive voice. Okay, so the first example there reads for the active voice. At each restaurant, the host ate at least one burger from the menu. The passive voice there reads, at each restaurant, at least one burger from the menu was eaten by the host. Okay, do you see what I'm talking about there? So in active voice, it's the action first and then the receiver of the action. In passive voice, it's the receiver of the action, then the doer. Okay, so it's three things. Another example there on page 128 is, so the active voice, Lady Gaga won the Academy Award for Best Song. Passive voice, the Academy Award for Best Song was won by Lady Gaga. So again, there's the active voice, there's a doer, action, receiver of the action. In the passive voice, it's the receiver of the action, then the doer. So once a presenter has mastered and executed once a presenter is able to master and execute the active voice, they will have set the listener up to anticipate the resolution, the payoff, or the punchline. And this is then the final part of a link, and it comprises of the moment in which the presenter rewards the listener and resolves the earlier setup, or they tell a joke, or they throw in an unexpected twist into the story. The payoff is really the reward that the listener gets for having listened to the story or the link. Okay, so the payoff is their reward. To construct a payoff, always ask yourself what you want the listener to remember from this link. What do you want them to take from the link? This will also help define the payoff for links that are simply utility-based. So for example, a news story, details surrounding the traffic or a weather forecast. So finding the crux, okay, so the payoff for the crux is the most important leave behind. So defining the crux or most important leave behind will allow you to construct and set up your payoff effectively. Another tool to use to help plan and execute a link is called the execution rule of 4. Noah Charney, who's a sitcom and TV writer, proposes the following template: the teaser, the trouble, the muddle, the triumph or the failure, and then the kicker. So the teaser is presenting the characters and the obstacle. The trouble is presenting a conflict or allowing for a desire to arise. The muddle is where the initial strategy leads to a new obstacle. The triumph or the failure, the moment in which the strategy is successful or unsuccessful. And then lastly, the kicker, the ending in which the changes took place as a result are depicted. Randy Lane, a communications professor from the Randy Lane Company, suggests that when preparing a link, start with the following 4 questions. Number 1, what is the payoff for the listener? 2, how can we write it in order to engage listeners within 10 or 8 seconds? 3, what are our views on the topic? And 4, what can we do to add more layers? So these questions can be used as a template for planning the link in detail. On page 129, there's a figure that starts, there's a link planning template that starts on the left with the story, then the tease, then the setup, then the point of view, then the exit, okay? So in conclusion, if you follow the basic rules that was discussed in the previous lecture and in today's lecture, which started off by designing your clock, then defining the type of content that you will fill in the clock, followed by the construction of the actual link in the content itself, you have a formulaic, systematic approach to creating the most interesting, entertaining, and engaging audio content possible for an hour of radio or another piece of spoken word content. And with that, we're going to end off today's lecture. We're going to leave it there. And I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next lecture.